For 10 years, she had lived by a rule that no one in the hospital could fully understand. Every time the schedule for night duty was posted, her name was always missing. It was not once or twice. It was every single rotation without exception. Others came and went through night shifts, but she remained firmly on daytime duty. At first, people assumed it was just a temporary request. In hospitals, staff often ask for adjustments because of health, family, or study. No one thought much of it in the beginning, but as months turned into years, and years slowly stretched into nearly a decade, the pattern became impossible to ignore. She never worked nights, not even once. She was not careless in her work. In fact, during the day, she was one of the most reliable staff members in the entire hospital. Patients trusted her easily. Doctors appreciated how calm she stayed even during emergencies. Junior staff often watched her closely, trying to learn how she handled pressure without ever raising her voice. There was something steady about her presence. She never seemed rushed, yet she never fell behind. She would arrive early, prepare her station carefully, and check every detail twice before starting her rounds. Even when the hospital became loud and chaotic, she stayed focused in a way that made others feel more stable around her. But the night shift rule created distance between her and everyone else. In a hospital that never truly slept, night duty was considered part of the identity of every serious staff member. It was during the night that emergencies felt heavier. Fewer staff were available, and decisions often had to be made quickly. Those who avoided night shifts were quietly noticed, even if no one said it out loud. At first, her colleagues tried to be polite about it. They would joke lightly during lunch breaks, asking if she simply disliked staying up late. She would only offer a small smile and change the topic. She never explained herself. That silence slowly built a wall between her and the rest of the team. Some began to respect her boundaries. Others became curious. A few even started to feel slightly annoyed, especially when schedules had to be adjusted to cover her absence at night. But no one ever confronted her directly. There was something about her calm expression that made people stop before asking too many questions. Still, whispers began to form in quiet corners of the hospital. Some said she must have a family responsibility that no one knew about. Others thought she might have a health condition that made night work difficult. A few even believed she had once experienced something disturbing during night duty and never recovered from it. None of these ideas were confirmed, but in places like hospitals, silence always created stories. She never corrected anyone. She never defended herself. She simply continued working her daytime shifts with the same quiet dedication as always. Years passed like this. The hospital changed in many ways during that time. New equipment arrived. New staff were hired. Some senior doctors retired, and new leadership took over. But one thing remained constant. Her name was always assigned to daytime duty, never the night. Even administrators who tried to adjust the roster eventually stopped questioning it. It became one of those unspoken rules that people accepted without understanding. Still, there was something unusual about the way she reacted whenever night shifts were mentioned in general conversation. It was subtle, almost invisible at first. If someone casually complained about a long night duty, she would become slightly quieter. Not uncomfortable in an obvious way, but distant, as if her thoughts had moved somewhere else. Sometimes, she would pause for a moment too long before responding to questions about work schedules. Then she would quickly return to normal conversation, as if nothing had happened. But observant people noticed these small changes. No one could connect them to a clear explanation. One evening, a new administrative review was ordered at the hospital. It was part of a routine process where staff records were checked and updated. Most employees did not think much of it. Paperwork was common, and such reviews rarely changed anything in daily life. But on that same evening, something unexpected happened. A high-ranking general arrived at the hospital. His visit was not announced in advance. There was no public explanation given to most staff. He was simply escorted inside with quiet formality, accompanied by hospital leadership. His presence immediately changed the atmosphere. Even those who had nothing to do with military matters felt a strange seriousness in the air. He did not speak much at first. He moved through the administrative section, reviewing files and asking short, direct questions. The hospital staff responded carefully, aware that every detail mattered. His attention to paperwork was precise, almost unusual. At one point, while going through a list of staff assignments, his eyes stopped on a particular name. He did not react loudly. There was no visible shock. But he paused longer than usual, holding the paper as if he had recognized something hidden beneath the surface. The room around him remained quiet, but his expression subtly changed. He asked for the full record. The administrators quickly provided additional files. As he read, his focus deepened. The more he looked, the more serious he became. He did not interrupt or comment immediately. Instead, he studied everything carefully, line by line. The name on the file belonged to her, the same staff member who had avoided night shifts for 10 years. No one in the room understood why this particular file mattered so much. To them, it was just another employee record with an unusual scheduling preference. But the general's reaction suggested something entirely different. After several minutes, he closed the file gently and asked a simple question. How long had she been working in this hospital? The answer came quickly. Almost 10 years of continuous service. He nodded once, but his silence carried more weight than words. It was clear that he was not seeing her as just another hospital worker. He was seeing something tied to a past that others did not know about. Later that evening, after leaving the administrative office, he requested to observe hospital operations during the night. This surprised the staff, because his visit was expected to be short and formal. But his request was accepted without question. As night began to fall, the hospital changed its rhythm. The daytime noise slowly faded. Lights in certain corridors became dimmer, while emergency sections grew more active. The general stood in a quiet hallway, watching the shift in atmosphere. He asked about staffing for the night. Names were mentioned. Rotations were explained. And once again, her absence from night duty stood out in the conversation, even without emphasis. The general did not comment immediately, but his attention returned to her file in his mind. Meanwhile, she was finishing her daytime duties as usual, unaware that anything unusual was happening. She moved through her tasks with calm precision, checking charts, assisting patients, and preparing reports for the next day. Her routine remained unchanged, as it had been for years. But that night, something felt slightly different to those around her. A few colleagues noticed she seemed quieter than usual, not distracted, but inwardly focused, as if something in the environment felt heavier than normal. No one knew that her name had already been studied carefully by someone who understood more than they did. And no one yet understood why a single detail in her record had made a general pause for so long. The general remained in the hospital longer than anyone expected. What was supposed to be a short administrative visit slowly turned into something more serious, though he never announced it openly. He simply stayed, moving between offices and reviewing records with quiet focus. The hospital leadership tried to stay composed, but they could feel that his interest in one staff member's file was not ordinary curiosity. It was recognition. The next morning, the hospital felt different. Word had already spread that a senior military figure was still inside the building. Staff members spoke in low voices, unsure why someone of his rank would spend so much time in a medical facility. Some assumed it was related to security coordination. Others thought it might involve a past case or a high-profile patient. But no one guessed the truth. Early that day, the general requested additional records. Not general reports, not summaries, but full historical files from years earlier. The request surprised the administrative team. Some of those files were old, archived, and rarely accessed. They were stored in digital systems that required special permission to open. Still, his authority made refusal impossible. As the files were brought to him, he did not rush. He read slowly, carefully, as if every line mattered more than the last. His expression remained controlled, but there was a shift in his eyes whenever he reached certain sections. Her name appeared again and again in different duty logs, always during daytime shifts in recent years. Always consistent, reliable, present. But he was not looking at the present. He was searching for something buried in the past. After some time, he paused at a section that most staff would have overlooked. It was an old assignment record from years ago, marked under a special coordination unit in Kabul. The label itself was plain, but to him it carried weight. For a long moment he did not speak. The room around him remained silent, waiting. The hospital administrator stood nearby, unsure whether to ask anything or remain quiet. The tension was subtle but real, like the air before a storm that never fully arrives. Finally, the general asked a simple question. Who assigned her to that unit? The question was calm, but it carried a seriousness that immediately changed the atmosphere. The administrator hesitated before answering. The assignment had been part of a special rotation approved during a difficult period years ago. It had involved emergency medical support in a high-pressure environment. He listened without interruption. Then he asked for the complete timeline. As the details were read aloud, something became clearer. She had not simply worked in that unit. She had remained there through an extended period when staffing was unstable. While others rotated in and out, she stayed longer than expected. Her role had required night availability more than day presence. That detail mattered. The general leaned back slightly, looking at the document as if seeing something beyond the text. It was not surprise on his face. It was recognition mixed with something heavier, something like memory. For a moment, he was no longer in the hospital. He was somewhere else. A different time. A different environment. One where medical teams worked under pressure that most people would never fully understand. Nights there were not ordinary nights. They carried a different weight where decisions had to be made quickly, often without complete information. He remembered names, movements, routines, and among them, there was a figure who stood out, not because of volume or authority, but because of calm consistency, a presence that did not break under pressure. He returned to the present slowly, blinking once as if pulling himself back from memory. No one in the room spoke. After a while, he asked for more recent logs again. He wanted to see when exactly she had stopped participating in night duties in that region. The administrator explained that after a certain period, she had been reassigned and later returned to standard hospital service elsewhere. But something important had changed at that point. She had never again taken night shifts. The general listened carefully, his eyes fixed on the report. There was a clear turning point in the timeline. Before it, she had been flexible, even active in night operations. After it, there was a complete and permanent stop. No exceptions. No temporary changes. Just a firm boundary that never moved again. That pattern was what had drawn his attention from the very beginning. Because patterns like that did not appear without reason. Later that afternoon, the general requested something unexpected. He asked to observe the hospital during the transition between day and night shifts again. It was not a formal inspection. It was more like he wanted to understand the rhythm of the place where she now worked. The staff found it unusual but complied. As evening approached, the hospital slowly shifted again. Day staff began handing over responsibilities. Night staff prepared to take over. The corridors became quieter in some areas, busier in others. It was a familiar rhythm, but with his presence, everything felt slightly more intense. She was there, finishing her daytime duties as usual. Unaware of the attention focused on her history, she moved through the ward with the same steady calm she had always shown, checking reports, speaking briefly with patients, making sure nothing was missed before ending her shift. There was no visible sign that anything weighed on her beyond normal responsibility. But the general was watching carefully now. Not her actions in isolation, but how she interacted with the environment. There was a certain discipline in the way she completed tasks. Not rushed, not hesitant, just precise. As if every action had been practiced over years until it became second nature. When she finally prepared to leave for the day, she paused briefly at a corridor window. It was a small moment, almost unnoticeable. She looked outside for a few seconds longer than usual, then turned away. The general noticed that pause. It was not fear, not distraction. It was something else, something internal. He did not comment. Instead, he quietly asked one of the senior staff about her current assignment preferences. The answer was immediate. She had requested permanent daytime duty years ago and had maintained it ever since without exception. That confirmed the pattern again. Still, no one could explain why. As night fully settled over the hospital, the general remained in a quiet observation area. He did not interfere with operations. He simply watched how the hospital functioned when half of its staff changed roles. And in the middle of that transition, his thoughts stayed on one person. Not because of what she was doing now, but because of what she had clearly done before and what she had deliberately stepped away from. At one point, he asked if she could be called for a brief conversation. The request created immediate hesitation among staff. It was unusual for a general to directly speak with a regular hospital worker without formal briefing. But he made it clear that it would be informal and brief. Still, before any decision was made, he added something quietly. No pressure. Only if she agrees. That sentence changed the tone slightly. It was no longer about authority. It was about understanding. As the message was prepared to be delivered to her, she was still unaware of the depth of attention surrounding her past. She continued her normal routine, gathering her things, preparing to leave, thinking only about the next ordinary day. But behind her calm life, something long buried was slowly being brought closer to the surface. And the general, standing quietly in the fading light of the hospital corridor, already seemed certain of one thing. Her refusal to work nights was not random. It was connected to something that had never been spoken about openly. Something he now intended to understand fully. The message was finally delivered to her near the end of her shift. It came through a senior nurse, spoken carefully and respectfully, as if even the wording mattered. She was told that a visiting general had requested a brief, informal conversation with her. Not an order, not a requirement, just a request. First, she did not respond immediately. She stood still for a moment, holding a file she had just completed. Her expression did not change, but something in her eyes shifted slightly, like a small crack in a wall that had been standing for a long time. She asked one simple question. About what? The nurse hesitated, unsure how to answer without creating more curiosity. She finally said it was about her past assignments. Nothing more. No details. Just that her service history had drawn attention. That was enough to make her pause again. For a brief moment, she looked toward the corridor window, the same way she often did at the end of the day. Outside, the light was fading. The hospital was entering its night rhythm again. A transition she always tried to leave behind. She exhaled slowly. Then she gave a quiet answer. Tell him, I will come for a few minutes. Her voice was calm, but it carried something restrained beneath it. Not fear, not anger, something closer to acceptance, like she had already known this moment might come one day. When she arrived at the designated room, the atmosphere felt different from any other meeting she had attended in the hospital. It was not an office and it was not a medical station. It was a quiet consultation space usually used for sensitive discussions. The lighting was soft, the walls plain, and the silence unusually heavy. The general was already there. He stood near the window, not sitting, as if he preferred to observe the environment before speaking. When she entered, he turned slowly and acknowledged her presence with a simple nod. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. It was not an uncomfortable silence. It was something else. A kind of pause where both sides were trying to understand what the other carried without words. Finally, he gestured toward a chair. Please, he said calmly. Sit. She did, carefully placing her file beside her without opening it. Her posture remained straight, professional but not rigid. It was clear she was used to formal environments, even if she preferred to stay distant from them. The general took a seat opposite her. For a moment, he did not begin with questions. Instead, he studied her quietly, not in a way that felt intrusive, but in a way that suggested recognition mixed with uncertainty. Then he spoke. I have reviewed your records. She nodded once. No surprise. No reaction beyond acknowledgement. He continued. There is a pattern. One that does not match your current behavior. She did not respond immediately. Her fingers tightened slightly around the edge of her file, then relaxed again. It was subtle, almost invisible, but noticeable to someone paying close attention. He leaned forward slightly. Years ago, you worked in a specialized medical environment in Kabul. At the mention of that place, something changed in her expression. It was not dramatic, but it was real. A quiet stillness settled over her, as if the room had become slightly smaller. He watched carefully, then added more gently, "I am not here to question your decisions. I am trying to understand them." She looked down for a moment, not away from him completely, but toward the space between them, as if gathering thoughts that had not been spoken in a long time. For several seconds, she said nothing. Then she finally spoke. Her voice was steady, but lower than before. That place was different. The general did not interrupt. He simply waited. She continued slowly. People think hospitals are the same everywhere. But some places are not like that. She paused again, choosing words carefully. In Kabul, during that time, nights were not just shifts. They were something else entirely. Her eyes did not meet his. Instead, she seemed to be looking somewhere far away, not physically, but in memory. The general remained silent. She continued, "There were days when we did not know how many would arrive at once. Sometimes it was quiet for hours, and then everything changed in minutes. The night always felt longer than the day." Her hands rested still now, no longer gripping anything. "I was assigned there for what was supposed to be a limited rotation." She gave a faint, almost invisible smile, but it carried no joy. Limited rarely meant limited. The general's expression tightened slightly, but he still did not speak. She went on. "At first, I thought I could manage everything. The work, the pressure, the lack of rest. Everyone thinks that at the beginning." Her voice remained controlled, but there was a thin layer of emotion underneath now. "Then you stop thinking in days. You start thinking in shifts. And nights become something you prepare for without ever feeling ready." She finally looked up briefly, meeting his eyes for the first time. "And then something happens that changes how you see those nights forever." She did not elaborate immediately. The silence returned, heavier this time. The general's voice was softer when he finally spoke. "You do not need to continue if you are not ready." She shook her head slightly. "No," she said. "It is not about readiness anymore. It is about why I never returned to them." She took a slow breath. "In that unit, I worked with people who believed in control. Control over chaos, over timing, over decisions that had to be made quickly. But there are moments when control is not enough." Her gaze lowered again. "There was a night when everything felt normal at first. The usual rhythm. The usual uncertainty. Nothing unusual on the surface." She paused, and for the first time her voice softened noticeably. "But something stayed with me after that night." The general did not press her. He simply listened. She continued, "It was not one event that broke everything. It was the accumulation of many things. Small moments that together became too heavy." She tapped her fingers lightly on the edge of the chair, almost unconsciously. "After that period, I was reassigned. I left that environment. I thought distance would be enough." She exhaled slowly. "But distance does not always remove memory." The room remained quiet for a long moment. Then she added something more personal. "When I first came here, I tried to work night shifts again. Just once. I told myself it would be fine." Her voice lowered further. "But when the shift started, I realized I could not stay the same person I was during the day and the same person at night. They felt like two different versions of me." She looked at the general again, more firmly this time. "So I chose one." The general nodded slowly, absorbing her words. She continued, "I did not refuse night shifts because I am unable to work. I refused because I knew what it would bring back." There was no dramatization in her tone. No attempt to make it sound bigger than it was. It was simply stated as fact. The general leaned back slightly, processing everything she had said. For a while, neither of them spoke again. Outside the room, the hospital continued its night cycle. Footsteps in corridors. Distant announcements. The quiet rhythm of a place that never truly stopped. Inside, time felt slower. Finally, the general asked a careful question. Why did you never explain this before? She looked down again, this time longer. Because explanations do not always change decisions, she said. And most people do not want to carry what they cannot see. Her words were not bitter, just honest. The general nodded once. There was another silence, but it was different now. Less tense. More reflective. After a while, he spoke again. I asked for your file because I recognized something in it. She looked up slightly, waiting. He continued. Not the details. The pattern. She listened quietly. There are people who function under pressure, and there are people who carry pressure even after it ends. Your record showed both. He paused. That is not common. She did not respond immediately, but her expression softened slightly, as if something in his words had reached a place she rarely allowed others to see. The conversation did not continue much longer. There was no resolution, no dramatic conclusion. Only understanding slowly forming between two people who had finally connected pieces of a story that had remained incomplete for years. When she eventually stood to leave, the general did not stop her. But before she reached the door, he spoke one final sentence. You are not required to go back to anything that breaks you. She stopped briefly, but did not turn around. Then she continued walking out of the room. And for the first time in a long while, the silence she carried felt slightly lighter, though the past itself had not disappeared. After she left the room, the general remained seated for a long time. The door closed quietly behind her, but the silence she left behind did not feel empty. It felt full, like something important had just been placed in the middle of the room and neither of them had fully looked at it yet. He stared at the space where she had been sitting, replaying her words in his mind. Not just the events she had described, but the pauses between them. The way her voice had lowered at certain moments. The way she had chosen some words carefully and avoided others completely. He had seen many reports in his life. He had heard many testimonies. But what he had just heard was not a report. It was something more fragile. Something still living inside her, even after all these years. Outside, the hospital continued its night routine. But inside the administrative section, everything felt slower, quieter, as if the building itself was reacting to what had just been revealed. A senior hospital administrator entered after a knock, asking if the general needed anything. He did not answer immediately. Then he finally said, No, just give me a few more minutes. The administrator left without further questions. The general opened her file again. This time, he did not read it like an official document. He read it like a timeline of a person trying to move forward while carrying something heavy behind them. He noticed things he had not focused on before. Small gaps in scheduling history. Changes in assignment patterns. A sudden stop in night duty that was not explained in formal notes, but now made sense in a different way. Not as avoidance, but as survival. He leaned back in his chair and closed the file slowly. For the first time since arriving at the hospital, his expression was no longer that of a commander reviewing data. It was something more personal. A quiet understanding that did not require authority. He stood up and walked toward the window. From there, he could see the hospital courtyard faintly lit under soft lights. Staff moving between buildings. A few ambulances arriving and leaving. Life continuing in its ordinary rhythm, unaware of the weight of stories hidden inside it. He thought about her again, not as a staff member, but as someone who had learned to separate parts of herself just to continue functioning. And then he thought about something else. Her sentence, I chose one. It was simple, but it carried a cost that most people would never understand. The next morning, the hospital was informed that the general would remain for another day. No official reason was given. But internally, a small adjustment began to take place. Meetings were rescheduled. Records were reorganized. Staff were informed that there might be further discussions regarding past assignments and current workload structures. She was not told much beyond that she might be called again if needed. And that was enough to make her cautious. She did not avoid her duties. She continued working as usual. But those around her noticed something subtle had changed. She was still calm, still precise, still professional. But there was a distance in her presence that had not been there before. Not emotional distance from others, but a kind of internal awareness, as if she knew part of her past had been opened and was now sitting somewhere close, waiting to be understood fully. The general requested access to a different set of records that afternoon. This time, he asked for operational logs from the period she had mentioned. Not just her personal file, but the environment around it. Staffing rotations, night emergency patterns, assignment pressures. The hospital staff complied. As he studied those records, something became clearer to him. Her experience had not been isolated. It had been part of a system operating under extreme conditions. A system where people were stretched beyond normal limits, where roles blurred, and where emotional strain was often carried silently. But even in that system, some individuals carried more than others. And she had been one of them. Later that day, he asked to walk through the hospital corridors without escort. It was unusual but allowed. He moved slowly through different sections. Emergency rooms, waiting areas, staff corridors. He did not speak much. He observed. At one point, he passed by a small nurse station where she was reviewing patient files. She did not notice him immediately. He stopped a few steps away, watching her work. There was something steady about her focus. Not rigid, not detached, just controlled. As if she had learned how to remain fully present in the moment, without letting other thoughts take over. A young nurse nearby quietly pointed out his presence. She looked up then. Their eyes met briefly. There was no tension in that moment. No fear. No discomfort. Just acknowledgement. She gave a small nod and returned to her work. The general did not approach. He simply continued walking. But that brief moment stayed in his mind longer than expected. That evening, he requested a second conversation with her. This time, it was not in an office. It was in a quiet outdoor area behind the hospital, where staff sometimes went to rest during breaks. The air was cooler, and the sound of distant city movement blended with hospital activity. When she arrived, she seemed slightly more prepared than before. Not nervous, but aware. He was already there, standing near a bench. He gestured for her to sit if she wanted, but she remained standing for a moment before choosing to sit beside him. They did not begin immediately. For a while, they simply looked ahead. Then the general spoke. "I have been reviewing more than your file." She listened without reacting. "I have been looking at the environment you worked in, the conditions, the structure, the expectations." She nodded slightly, but said nothing. He continued. "It explains a lot." She finally spoke. "Explains what?" He paused before answering. "Why people like you leave certain parts of their work behind without ever formally leaving." Her expression did not change, but her eyes softened slightly. She looked ahead again. "I did not leave," she said quietly. "I adapted." He turned slightly toward her. "Adaptation and separation are not always different things," he said. She did not respond immediately. A soft breeze moved through the area, carrying distant sounds from the hospital. After a while, she spoke again. "I did not want sympathy." The general shook his head. "This is not sympathy." She looked at him briefly. "What is it then?" He considered his answer carefully. "Recognition." The word hung in the air for a moment. She looked away again as if processing it. For years, she had lived with her choices being seen only as personal preference. A scheduling request. A limitation. A rule she did not break. But now, someone was describing it differently. Not as avoidance. Not as refusal. But as something that had a reason behind it. She exhaled slowly. "I never expected anyone to look that deeply into it," she said. The general nodded. "Most people do not." There was a pause. Then he added something more carefully. "I also understand something else now." She waited. "You are still carrying that place with you, even here." She did not deny it, because it was true. There was a long silence after that. Not uncomfortable, just heavy with understanding that did not need further explanation. Finally, she stood up. "I should go," she said. The general also stood. Before she left, he spoke once more. "I am not here to change your past decisions." She nodded slightly. But I may need your perspective in something going forward. She stopped for a moment, then gave a small, cautious reply. If it is about work, I can answer. He gave a slight nod. Not just work, he said. Understanding systems like the one you were in matters more than people realize. She did not respond further. But as she walked back toward the hospital, something in her expression had shifted again. Not relief, not closure, something quieter. A sense that part of her story had finally been seen clearly, even if it was not finished yet. Behind her, the general remained standing for a few moments longer, watching the path she had taken. And for the first time since arriving, he was no longer just trying to understand her past. He was beginning to understand what it meant for someone to continue living with it. The next morning felt different in a way no one could clearly explain. The hospital was still the same building, with the same routines, the same long corridors, and the same constant movement of staff and patients. But something subtle had shifted in the atmosphere. It was not visible at first glance. It was felt more than seen. People were quieter than usual when discussing schedules. Conversations near the nurses' station were shorter. Even the usual complaints about workload were spoken more carefully, as if everyone sensed that something important was being examined just beneath the surface of daily work. She arrived at her usual time. Nothing about her appearance suggested change. Same calm steps, same composed expression, same steady routine of checking assignments and preparing for the day. But those who worked closely with her noticed something small. She was more aware of her surroundings than before. Not distracted, but attentive in a deeper way. As if she knew that part of her life had already been opened and could not be closed in the same way again. The general arrived shortly after. This time, there was no sudden tension in the hospital corridors. His presence was still significant, but it no longer created confusion or speculation. People had begun to understand that his visit was not random. It was tied to something more personal and more complex than a standard inspection. He did not immediately call for meetings or request documents. Instead, he asked for a simple review of staffing practices. Not as a command, but as a discussion. The hospital leadership gathered in a quiet conference room. She was invited as well, though she was not told why her presence might be relevant beyond general discussion. When she entered, she noticed him already seated at the far end of the table. He gave a small nod. She responded in the same way and took a seat without drawing attention to herself. The meeting began with general topics: staffing balance, night shift rotations, workload distribution. It was the kind of discussion she had heard many times before in different forms. But gradually the focus shifted. The general spoke carefully, choosing words that made it clear he was not questioning performance, but structure. There are individuals in this hospital who have long-term scheduling patterns that were never formally reviewed beyond administrative acceptance, he said. Some staff members glanced at each other, unsure where this was going. He continued, in some cases, these patterns may reflect deeper experiences that were never documented in standard records. There was a brief silence. She remained still, listening without interruption. The general then looked toward her, not directly confronting, but including her in the discussion without isolating her. I am not asking for personal disclosure, he added. I am asking whether systems are flexible enough to support individuals who have reasons that are not always visible on paper. The room stayed quiet. Then one of the senior administrators spoke carefully. In practice, we usually accommodate requests when they are consistent and do not disrupt operations. The general nodded. That is operational efficiency, he said. But understanding context is something different. No one responded immediately. She looked down slightly, as if thinking about the words rather than the conversation itself. It was not the first time she had been part of discussions about scheduling. But it was the first time those discussions felt like they were indirectly acknowledging something she had carried silently for years. After a pause, the general spoke again. I have reviewed historical data from multiple deployments and hospital assignments under similar conditions. He did not mention her name this time, but everyone in the room understood where the discussion was anchored. There are patterns where individuals withdraw from specific duties not due to incapacity, but due to accumulated experience that is not recorded in formal reports. He leaned slightly forward. And when those patterns are not understood, they are often misinterpreted. She finally looked up. Her expression was calm, but there was something different in her eyes now. Not defensiveness, not discomfort, something closer to recognition that her experience was no longer being treated as an isolated exception. The meeting continued for another hour, focusing on broader policy adjustments and review procedures. No decisions were finalized. No immediate changes were announced. But something important had already happened. The way people in the room thought about her situation had shifted. After the meeting ended, she walked out quietly, as she always did. The general followed at a distance, not calling her back immediately. Outside, the hospital courtyard was brighter than usual. Morning light spread across the building, softening the edges of the long night before. She stood near the walkway for a moment, adjusting the file in her hands. He approached slowly. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. Then he said something simple. "You were right about one thing." She looked at him. He continued. "Most people do not want to carry what they cannot see." She nodded slightly, not denying it. There was a pause before she responded. "I never expected them to." The general studied her for a moment, then said something that carried less authority and more understanding. "But that does not mean they should not try." She did not answer immediately. Instead, she looked toward the hospital building, the place where she had worked for years, the place where she had built a life defined by consistency, control, and quiet boundaries. Then she spoke softly. "I do not want my past to define how people see my present work." He nodded. "That is not what I am suggesting." She turned slightly toward him. "Then what are you suggesting?" He took a moment before answering. "That your experience should not only explain your limitations. It should also inform how others are supported." She listened carefully. For the first time, the conversation was not about why she had avoided night shifts. It was about what that avoidance meant in a larger context. Not as a personal issue, but as part of a system that often failed to recognize silent burdens. She looked down for a moment, then spoke. "I am still the same person who works here every day." The general nodded. "Yes," she continued, "but I am not the same person I was before that assignment." He agreed without hesitation. "That is also true." There was no judgment in his voice, only acknowledgement. A light breeze moved through the courtyard, carrying distant sounds of hospital activity. A reminder that life inside continued regardless of personal histories or internal struggles. She took a slow breath. "I do not regret my decision," she said finally, "but I also do not forget why I made it." The general responded quietly. "Both can exist at the same time." That sentence stayed between them for a moment. Simple, but complete. After a while, he added something unexpected. "I will not be extending my presence here much longer." She looked at him, slightly surprised, but did not show it strongly. He continued, "But I will be submitting a report recommending review of assignment structures in similar cases." She understood what that meant. Not for her alone, but for others who might have been in similar situations without anyone noticing. She gave a small nod. "Then maybe it will help someone else," she said. The general looked at her with a quiet seriousness. "It already has." She did not respond, but her expression softened slightly. There was nothing dramatic in that moment. No emotional breakthrough. No visible transformation. Just a quiet understanding that her story, which had been carried alone for so long, had finally been seen in a way that extended beyond her own life. She turned to leave. After a few steps, she paused briefly, then looked back. "Thank you," she said simply. The general nodded once. Not as a superior, not as a commander, but as someone who understood that some stories do not need resolution to be respected. She walked back into the hospital, and this time the corridors did not feel heavier. They felt the same as always, but she no longer felt invisible inside them. Behind her, the general stood for a moment longer, watching the flow of people entering and leaving the building. Then he finally turned away, knowing that some things do not end with conclusions. They end with understanding.